Democrat challenge to the president's emergency declaration, and we'll be joined live by Ed Henry in Hanoi. Plus, we've got a lot of loony left action for you tonight. My take on how to respond to the growing appeal of socialism, and a truly frightening new statement from loony left leader AOC. And in our 2020 roundup this week, we'll have a live action reenactment of one of the strangest stories of the week. Now, President Obama, he had a pen and a phone. I have a salad and a comb.
Oh, no.
And that is all I'm telling you. You've got to wait and see what we do with that. It's going to be fun. But first, let's get to that upcoming battle over the border wall. Speaker Nancy Pelosi will introduce a motion on Tuesday to overturn the president's emergency declaration. The key questions seem to be, will any Republicans vote for it in the House? And will enough Republicans vote for it so it passes in the Senate? Let's get into all that. With me tonight, Fox News and Fox Business anchor Melissa Francis. It's been a while. So great to see you back on the show.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled.
And Fox News contributor and independent voice, Women's Voice President Tammy Bruce.
Hi. How are you?
And Congressman Sean Duffy from Wisconsin. You were on the other week. We love talking to you about your bill on tariffs.
Reciprocal Trade Act, yeah.
Exactly. Hope we can get time for a quick update on that. But let's get to this border war situation still ongoing. You've got Nancy Pelosi fighting back. It seems to me that she thinks this is going to be a tactical success. She's going to win the vote in the House to say that the president was wrong to do his emergency declaration. But I think long-term, strategically, this could put the Democrats in a box of looking like they're for open borders. What do you make of it?
Spot on. So is anyone surprised that Nancy Pelosi doesn't support border security right now and is anti-Trump? I think the way this is going to play out is it very well will pass the House, right? You might get a few Republicans to break and vote with Democrats. The question is what happens in the Senate. Do we lose 4 Republican senators to vote for this package? But either way, if it does pass the House and the Senate, the president's going to veto it, and we're going to have some ruling by the courts as to whether the president was in his lane for a national emergency, and I think he is, frankly. I mean, the national emergency legislation from 1976 gives wide latitude to the president. I mean, he can take land, he can take means of production, he can declare martial law. I mean, there's a whole slew of things that he can do. I think he's well within his lane to take this action.
So, you hear that from a lot, but I just want to quickly ask you about your colleagues. Privately, are they saying, yeah, we got to support him on this, but we wish he hadn't done this?
So there's a lot of conservatives that say, listen, I think he's overstepped his bounds. I mean, we're very jealous of the separation of powers, and Republicans and Democrats in the Congress want to make sure we preserve our role that we have under the Constitution, and many of us feel that we've ceded too much power to the executive, to the president, whether it's Obama, Trump, or a Bush, a Clinton, and so that becomes a little bit of a backstory. But in the House, for sure, almost all Republicans support securing the border and keeping our people safe.
So, Melissa, where are you on that conservative argument of no matter who the president is, you don't want them just acting like a king?
I think it's absolutely true, but I think the best way for you guys to take your power back is, forgive me, to do your job. I mean, we've been waiting for Congress to reform immigration forever, and it has pushed the president to this point where he must do something extreme. I mean, there were vote after vote for a border fence. The funding was never in place. And so I think that we would love to see Congress take back its power and take back its duty and do what it should. I think the most interesting thing about this conversation is I can't remember the last time I heard Nancy Pelosi or a Democrat talk about the Dreamers. Remember, that's what this was about, people. Right. We haven't heard Democrats talk about human beings in this for so long. They could have gotten so much in exchange for anything along the border, but instead they seem to have forgotten all of those people that they were supposed to be fighting for. And I wonder if those people feel forgotten, and we'll show them at the ballot box the next time around.
That's such a great
they're not
point.
Fighting for them at all.
But that's right. And Tammy, I think that it relates to the earlier point I made about the politics of this, that in the end, they don't really care about that. There's just this ideological obsession now with A, doing anything to hurt President Trump, and B, being for open borders.
Yeah, the establishments work together, interestingly, on both these issues to get nothing done, on both border security and when it comes to the Dreamers. So it's one of the first things the president offered them, which made me very uncomfortable. I mean, they actually could work with him. But the difference is that he does want to accomplish it. He wants to do things. Before, we've had several generations now, 40, 60 years of things where you just kind of massage the monster and make sure that it's comfortable and maybe it moves a little bit, but not too much. Donald Trump is in there, and he really wants to do these things, and that's why Melissa's point is excellent in that. We've seen so much not happen with so much talk. It really is an emergency. Look, 2017, 70,000 people dead because of overdoses due to fentanyl and heroin, opioids, that over 80% of which comes through the southern border. 58, we're in Vietnam right now. That is more than all of our fatal casualties in Vietnam for the entire war. Of course, it's an emergency. But I would also say, when it comes to what the president wants to accomplish and what Nancy Pelosi is doing, of course she's going to have the votes in the House. But I welcome this. Let's see where people stand. Because remember with Obamacare, of course they passed it. And it decimated them in the next midterms. That's when the Republicans took the House. Because it wasn't what the American people wanted. And new Gallup poll, suburban women coming back to the president because they are for the wall. They are for border security.
It's a winning issue.
Important.
I believe that's exactly right. And you've got the evidence.
And the
Senate, I hadn't seen that.
The Senate, look, Mitch McConnell gets done what he wants to get done in the Senate whenever he wants to do that. Bottom line is, if the president has to veto it, it's even stronger for him.
Can I just make one point?
Quick last point.
I agree with Melissa. We have to do our job.
How useless you've all been.
Exactly. I'm getting very good.
Come on now. It's still a nice Sunday evening here.
But one quick point. We mostly agree on immigration reform. And, trying to deal with folks who are in the country unlawfully, who haven't committed crimes, but for coming into the country illegally. The big sticking point is border security. Democrats know that. If you want to get immigration fixed, like Melissa mentioned, you have to secure the border. We learned in 1987 from Reagan, you can't have amnesty today with border security tomorrow.
Yes.
So secure the border. We can take care of
that's
all
been
these
the
issues.
story all along, but it's never
do it.
But I don't want to do it.
That's why he will prevail. And reform has been the gaslighting term for a generation, and it's over because Trump's the president.
Exactly, and he's clear, doesn't use those kind of
That's
weasel
right.
words. Just a quick word for you. If you want more detail on the legal background before this debate in the House, before the bill comes up in the House next week, we had a really good discussion on Fox Nation on Deep Dive. So if you're on Fox Nation, go and check that out. Last Mondays that I hosted. If you're not on Fox Nation, why not? Get on with it. But it's really useful about the legal. We had a very smart legal professor from Stanford who explained that the legal justification for what President Trump is doing isn't just the National Emergencies Act. There's a lot more to it. Very interesting. All right, a quick Swamp Watch update for you. Last December, we told you about the horrific story of Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta, who helped protect billionaire hedge fund manager and convicted pedophile monster Jeffrey Epstein with a disgusting, and it now turns out illegal, plea deal when Acosta was U.S. District Attorney in Florida. It's a sickening example of the establishment looking after itself. Anyone who is outraged about the two-tier justice system that let the Clintons off the hook should be equally outraged over this. Yes, it was years ago, and yes, Acosta may be doing a good job now, but Americans voted for President Trump to end all this establishment corruption. There has to be accountability here. Otherwise, it will seem as if nothing has changed. Draining the swamp means dumping Acosta. Well, we're proud to say that our calls to fire Acosta for his involvement in the deal have helped gain the attention of the White House. Sarah Sanders said this week that they're looking into Acosta's role following a federal judge's ruling this week that prosecutors, including Acosta, violated the law when they failed to speak to victims before offering Epstein the plea deal. In response, the Department of Labor has released a statement including the following. For more than a decade, the actions of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida in this case have been defended by... You know what, I can't read this. This is sort of absolute bureaucratic gobbledygook. I can't believe they put that out there. You can read it if you want. There it is on the screen. The point here is that I think it's time for President Trump to find himself a new Labor Secretary. My vote would be for Mike Rowe, although he won't thank me for saying that. But I think that this is far too long, this has been going on, and we need some accountability. All right. Coming up, Ed Henry is live for us from Vietnam with an update on President Trump's summit with Kim Jong-un. Don't go away. There he is. What time of the day is it? Early morning, evening? Are you really alive?
I am really alive. We are 12 hours ahead of you. Steve, I've looked into the future, and things are going to be good for you.
Fantastic. So I hear there's some breaking news connected with China and this summit. What's that all about?
Yeah, obviously China is a critical player. North Korea is not going to move forward in terms of denuclearization without close consultation and coordination with China. President Trump just announced in the last hour or two that he believes they've made great progress in trade talks with China so that, A, he is going to delay tariff increases that were supposed to hit Chinese imports on March 1st. That's going to have a real impact on markets in the days ahead, number one. And number two, the president said that he will now have a summit one-on-one with President Xi of China after this summit with Kim Jong-un in the days ahead, and that will happen at Mar-a-Lago down in Florida. Why is that important? Well, it ties into the nuclear talks, as I mentioned. But I think it's also important to look. You already have people in the mainstream media creating this narrative and saying, President Trump's not going to accomplish anything here. They haven't made any progress. We heard that with China and the tariffs as well, and he stood up to China. He got them to the table, and now we see progress. The same may be happening here, and I underline the word may. We don't know yet. We don't want to get ahead of it. We don't want to be too bullish, but we also don't want to be too pessimistic, as some in the media are. A year and a half ago, when the president was talking about fire and fury, U.S. military power raining down on North Korea if they didn't cut out, these nuclear tests, the missiles that were flying over Japan and elsewhere, critics were saying that the president of the United States was going to push us into nuclear war. Here we are, Steve, a year and a half later. The world is a bit calmer. The president's at the table, the negotiating table, for the possibility of peace with North Korea, and he's making progress with China on trade. These are big developments.
Yeah, I totally agree. We're going to discuss that all in a second. But Ed, one last point to you. I was really interested to read that that Kim is traveling to Vietnam in a train, and it's a long journey, 2,500 miles or something like that. But the reason behind it I thought was fascinating, which is that he's keen to see the economic development that's taking place in China as he travels through, and in parts of Vietnam. And to me, that speaks to the kind of central difference, it seems to me, that President Trump is making, which is putting the focus on the economic aspect of this and the chance for economic development and to make money. It's a really different approach. You've got a business guy who's running this from the kind of foreign policy people who wouldn't really have put that emphasis there. How's that playing out?
And you're right. That's the glass half full here. We have to be realistic and clear-eyed that North Korea still has to make concessions in terms of moving towards denuclearization. They haven't done that yet. And the president has been holding firm so far in saying he's not lifting the boot off the neck in terms of economic sanctions against North Korea until they get serious about denuclearization. So that's going to be an important part of Hanoi. But you are right to point out this train ride of Kim Jong-un. So he's going through cities in China, where obviously it's still communist, but there's been some economic reforms, some move towards capitalism. The same here. Vietnam. This is why they're hosting the summit here, Steve, which is that you have a communist nation here, but the economy has been getting better, and people are seeing a bright future here in Vietnam. That might open Kim Jong-un's eyes to the possibility. And if you look at this big picture, 2/3 of the economic growth in the world is happening right here in Asia. This is a big part of the context of these talks, Steve.
All right, Ed, thank you so much. We'll be watching you over the next few days. Let's focus on the political aspect. Tammy, it seems to me that if this was any other president, Republican or Democrat, to have achieved this transformation in the relationship from being on the brink of war to an open and friendly dialogue, they would be hailed as a foreign policy genius.
Well, yes, but the other crime that President Trump is committing is, through his success, is he's highlighting how everyone else has failed. That's what, of course, the Democrats have always been afraid of from the start, is that if he is successful, that's why they have to deny the success, because then they would have to explain why they didn't get it. So this is an example of that.
Great point.
And clearly, his approach when it came to, saying, we're going to start war, or we're going to have to stop you this way, it's all part of the package of negotiating. But what I think the president's also been trying to do is trying to kind of pull Kim Jong-un away from China, believing perhaps that America could be a better bet that it could trust. Because right now, really, they can't do anything without China's approval. And that's why the president's trying to weave that in. Because ultimately, you're dealing with, these are not political decisions, really. This is a disturbed entity that has been helping terrorist nations, Al-Qaeda, Iran, from the start. And so it's not a rational actor. That's one of the issues. It's the actor that murdered Otto Warmbier. And this is, for me, heartbreaking that this is still the action we're taking to try to work with them as though they're a rational actor, and they're not.
I'm not entirely sure that's true, because I think that North Korea is motivated, the Kim regime, they're motivated by trying to hold on to power, and that involves money. And all of their money has come from China and these other nations that you name. And the violence has come from trying to hang on to power. And the president, I think, is trying to show him, you know, where you started, that you don't have to be dependent on these other people for money. You could open up the doors and have this other world. What I think is really interesting when you look at the way he's approaching this, and he gets criticized, and oh my gosh, by going there, you know, he's put Kim on this
platform.
Stage,
yeah,
on
we
this
keep hearing that.
Or whatever. So in diplomacy, it's more like a Spanish dance where they go forward and backward and they turn to each other and they turn away, whatever. In business, you walk right across the dance floor and you look into the other person's eyes and you shake their hand, and nothing gets done without that relationship and without that face-to-face meeting. That's step number one. So the president can't understand this diplomacy, and diplomats are very uncomfortable. I mean, whether he's saying Rocket Man or he's saying we're in love now, I mean, they're incredibly uncomfortable and critical because this isn't the way it's done. We'll see if it works. You know, I'm not saying it's going to work.
But what makes China nervous, too, is North Korea has been this buffer between America. They don't want America at their border.
Sorry, Tom, I've got to quickly get Sean in because we have to...
So quickly, you look at the left and the hypocrisy. When Obama goes to Cuba and normalizes relationships with the Castros, I mean, the left was celebrating. This was wonderful. And by the way, we got nothing for it. So Donald Trump goes to North Korea, doesn't give them anything. They've stopped shooting missiles over Japan. They're not testing nuclear weapons, and they criticize him for it. I think Donald Trump is brilliant for going to Vietnam to show, listen, you don't have to have democracy to have economic freedom and success. This could be your model.
Well, but Tam is right. It's showing because he's showing up their failure. That's why.
That's it.
It's a great point.
So it doesn't matter what the success is. It is still only about them and what they haven't done.
All right, coming up, my warning about the loony left's version of populism. Don't go away. Controlled immigration and the centralization of government and the economy. In 2016, that consensus was overthrown in a populist revolution. Of course, Donald Trump on the right, but also Bernie Sanders, paving the way for what we see today. The Democrats lurch to the populist left. That is dangerous for America, because the more we see of these new loony left policies, the clearer it is that they'd bring disaster for our economy and society. But it's a danger for Republicans too, because unless they develop a positive populist agenda of their own, they'll just be swept away. That's because on issue after issue, the populist left is responding to people's real concerns. Americans are right to be angry about inequality. If you're part of the globally connected knowledge economy elite, your wealth has soared over the last few decades. But for most working Americans, incomes have been flat or falling since the 1970s. Worse, many millions of responsible Americans who work hard still find themselves in a permanent and precarious state of economic insecurity. For example, a recent Federal Reserve study found that 40% of Americans couldn't afford a $400 emergency expense, like an unexpected medical bill. In response, AOC's Green New Deal, now backed by most leading Democrat presidential candidates, promises high-paying federal jobs to anyone who wants one. Cory Booker has actually introduced a job guarantee bill, claiming it would give all Americans a shot at a day's work and, by introducing competition into the labor market, raise wages and improve benefits for all workers. But the paper that his plan drew from estimated the total annual cost of a federal jobs guarantee to be over $500 billion. It's obvious who'd end up paying for it: the taxpayer, which, of course, is all part of the plan for the loony left populists.
Once you get to like the tippy tops, on your $10 millionth dollar, sometimes you see tax rates as high as 60 or 70%.
Tippy tops. Can't get enough of that. All right. Presidential candidate Julian Castro also wants to revoke the Trump tax cuts.
I absolutely would look at undoing the tax cuts that benefited the super wealthy and benefited corporations.
Wake up, Julian. I think you're not going to get the presidency if you're half asleep when you do your interviews. Anyway, Elizabeth Warren, she's planning a new wealth tax. Quote, "We need structural change," she says. "That's why I'm proposing an annual tax on the wealth of the richest Americans." But these taxes are not structural change. They're punitive, not positive. High taxes would actually hurt working Americans by cutting investment, leading to lower growth and fewer jobs. Wealth taxes make the rich poorer. They don't make the poor richer. But here's the key political point. Republicans can't just scream Venezuela about all this loony leftism. You need a positive populist alternative to give working Americans economic security. So instead of higher taxes on the rich, how about lower taxes on workers? Slash payroll taxes and institute a real living wage. It doesn't make any sense that the federal minimum wage hasn't budged in almost 10 years when the cost of living has only continued to rise. But in a broader sense, what the left's version of populism gets wrong about inequality and poverty is the superficial way they approach it. Their plans target the symptoms of poverty. We should be aiming at the underlying causes, and one of the biggest is family breakdown. Census data shows that children living with a divorced single parent are 50% more likely to be living below the poverty line compared to children from two-parent homes. Another study showed that, quote, the fraction of children living in single-parent households is the strongest negative correlate of upward income mobility. The left lecture us all the time about believing the science on climate change. Well, it's time they stopped denying the science on family. A child starts life at a steep disadvantage if they come from a broken family. The neighborhood they live in, the schools they attend, even the food they eat, these are all factors that impact childhood development and are affected by household income, which plunges if a family breaks up or never gets together in the first place. Here's what the populist left gets wrong about inequality. Americans understand that inequality is the price you pay for opportunity. And they're prepared to pay that price as long as everyone has access to opportunity. But the reason Americans are so angry right now is that the ladder of opportunity has been broken. Conservative populists need to put the rungs back on that ladder to reboot social mobility. That means helping families come together and stay together. But of course, it also means fixing education. In too many parts of the country, our schools are blocking opportunity instead of building it. 2016 figures show that in 1/3 of Baltimore's public high schools, not a single student scored proficient on the state's math exam. Not a single one. Another study found that in Chicago, 1 in 4 African-American students attends a subpar school. Of course, there are many excellent public schools in America, but they're typically the ones serving neighborhoods where families are already doing well. A Stanford study found that the gap in standardized test scores between affluent and low-income students has grown by about 40% between 1960 and 2007. The proven answer to this is to help children escape failing schools by giving their parents real choice. Of course, the public sector unions hate that because it's a threat to their power. But instead of backing opportunity, the loony left populists back the unions who block it. Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, they're all falling over themselves to suck up to their big union donors. What a bunch of hypocrites they are, railing against the rich, then doubling down on the very system that perpetuates inequality in America, the public sector education monopoly. Radical school choice should be the next big crusade for conservative populists. And it's one that has the advantage of being truly popular, with 73% support among Latinos, 68% among whites, and nearly the same with African Americans. But our education system blocks opportunity beyond high school. And once again, left-wing populists have exactly the wrong answer.
We should have free tuition at public colleges and universities. That should be a right of all Americans.
No, I think the word you're looking for, Bernie, is wrong. It's wrong to force every young American at taxpayer expense into a cookie-cutter 4-year college program ending in a useless degree that won't lead to a job but will land them with crippling debt. The unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-olds is over twice the national average, and student loan borrowers owe close to $1.5 trillion. But the left-wing populists strike a chord when they focus on this issue. So conservative populists need a positive answer. It's time for a radical rethink of the whole system. Make it much more open and flexible. Help students focus on their individual strengths. Often that might be a blue-collar career. Quote, the jobs that make civilized life possible, as my guest, Mike Rowe, put it a few weeks ago. Give every American the opportunity to thrive in the economy of the future with ongoing affordable access to skills training from the private sector. Build on the great start made by Ivanka Trump and her National Council for the American Worker. On jobs, on schools, on family, we've seen a decades-long collapse in opportunity. Yes, things have started to turn around, and that's great. But a half-century of establishment rule brought deep problems for working Americans. And the appeal of socialism is no surprise when capitalism failed for so many. That's why it is a huge risk for Republicans to just sit back and hope the loony left populists simply self-destruct. The establishment, it's dead. America's not going back to the corrupt and incompetent never-Trumpers and their swampy counterparts in the Democratic Party. The future is populist. The question is what kind? The negative, vindictive, top-down, centralizing authoritarianism of the left, or a positive people power version of populism on the right, pro-worker, pro-family, pro-community? Tell me what you think of that at Steve Hilton X and at NextRev FNC. Soon we'll take a look at the populist choice on immigration, healthcare, and much more. Coming up, Sean, Tammy, and Melissa are back with their take on all that and the latest news from the loony left. Don't miss it.
Because you are so dead on. We have all these people going off to school and loading up on debt to get a degree in literature. I was at the Kitchen and Bath Industry Show this week. They are desperate for workers. And it's not what you think. I mean, it is plumbing, but it's whatever it is you do. You're an artist. You're a computer designer. You want to do programs that are going to bring things to life. You want to, you know, the robots of the future, connecting to the internet, whatever it is. You can have a great paying job in this industry. They are desperate. They have 5 workers every year leave and only 1 comes back in. The problem is the training, and nobody is training anyone for these jobs. Now, these companies are desperate to come in and partner with the schools and train people for the jobs, but there's a lot of hurdles there with government and with getting the whole thing started and knowing how to fit in. And you have to have a teachers union that's open to it. We see where that goes, but I mean, these are great paying jobs in industry that wants to do the training.
We have a labor shortage.
Nobody's getting trained for the right job.
I think Melissa's spot on, but in our community, in Wausau, Wisconsin, we need more kids going into manufacturing. And a lot of our manufacturers were looking to government for a solution, the populist revolution. And it didn't happen. So they took it upon themselves. All the manufacturers got together and they started the heavy metal tour. Right. And they went to high schools and middle schools and got the kids and their parents to go tour the facilities and get kids interested in manufacturing. And they saw more kids going into this field, which was awesome. And it's a private sector partnering with the schools. And the biggest problem they had was counselors that were directing kids away from manufacturing and into a 4-year degree. And once they're done, they come back and they get that welding degree that they should have had at the outset. And just one last point on education. And we mentioned so many great things. But we have to stop teaching our kids this crap. Let's teach them useful skills. Let's teach them history and math and science. But there's such a liberal, progressive agenda being pushed on our kids that goes into the middle school.
By the way, we're going to see a bit of in our next topic coming up after the next break in relation to Dianne Feinstein and climate change. So it's exactly that point. Tammy.
Yeah, I think like in your opening, what you noted, of course, is this, what's effectively is class warfare. Instead of conversations about the nuts and bolts about how do we lift people up, individual by individual, it's complaints about the super rich and billionaires, because it's always for the left, for over 100 years. It's about chopping the heads off of the tall poppies. That brings some what they see as equity, because it's easier. It's hard work to bring up everyone else. And it's easier to just make it appear as though there's an equality by chopping off those other heads. But what you also have then with class warfare is, of course, a distrust. And it maintains a division in America, which fortunately I think we have resisted, because we have a lot more in common than the legacy media and the establishment wants you to think. But that's what they've relied on. Education, as we call it, has facilitated that. They come out hating conservatives, hating Republicans, hating straight white men. All of that is so that you even look at your neighbor or even your family with suspicion. Remember, what was Hillary's main complaint also was that white women were taking the orders of the men in their lives, of their husband or their son. You remember that?
I don't know who these women are she's talking about.
All of this rhetoric, all of this rhetoric has been meant to have women look at the men closest to them with suspicion. All of this, there's a method to their madness, and it's to keep people divided. None of their answers involve the nuts and bolts of really improving individual lives. They will resist it, and it's why the Republicans.
I'm so sorry. We've got to go. It's so much to talk about. I really appreciate the conversation. By the way, this is why President Trump is so different, because he's practical. Just looks at practical things.
And why he's
ideology.
such a threat.
All right, coming up. The loony left is back at it. Senator Dianne Feinstein, as I just mentioned, she was pilloried for her apostasy in questioning the practicality of the Green New Deal to a bunch of rude, brainwashed children. That's my take on them this week. We'll explain. We used to quite like the anti-establishment populist Democrats on issues like trade, immigration, and draining the swamp. Bernie Sanders was actually pretty close to President Trump a few years ago. But recently, and as we see more and more of their actual policies, it's all gone nuts. Here on The Next Revolution, we call them the loony left, and nothing these days is as loony and polarizing as the Green New Deal. And now kids are getting involved. Take a look at some children and young adults pressuring Senator Dianne Feinstein to support the Green New Deal.
We are trying to ask you to vote yes on the Green New Deal.
Please.
Okay, I'll tell you what. We have our own Green New Deal.
Some scientists have said that we have 12 years to turn this around.
Well, it's not going to get turned around in 10 years. What we can do,
Senator, if this doesn't get turned around in 10 years, you're looking at the faces of the people who are going to be living with these consequences.
I'm trying to do the best I can, which was to write a responsible resolution.
Any plan that doesn't take bold, transformative action is not going to be what we need.
Well, you know better than I do. So I think one day you should run for the Senate.
I just thought that was so, you know, like she's getting a ton of grief, Senator Feinstein, for sort of not handling that well. I just thought this was so obnoxious. The using those children as props, the rudeness, the hectoring, the lack of respect. I thought, and plus, you know, the kids going in there just going on about the Green New Deal in this uncritical manner. But just before we talk about it, one other thing I want to bring up which really frightened me, same sort of thing, this kind of belligerence now from the left, is this tweet from AOC about the Green New Deal this week. Look at that. If you don't like the Green New Deal, come up with your own proposals. Listen to this phrase. Until then, we're in charge. That's really chilling. It's a sort of authoritarianism to her. And she's getting, I don't know, I'm really worried about the whole thing.
On the left, first of all, the environment is their religion because it's replaced God and family and everything else. So you have to understand that, like, you know, this is really the flashpoint on the left. It also is, it's incredible to me that on your populist point, it is so elitist.
Yes,
because
exactly right.
Everything that they're talking about is going to make energy more expensive. Who does that hurt? Not rich people so much. It hurts poor working people. It's terrible. They get rid of jobs all over the place. They're saying it's going to bring out all these other jobs that you need a lot of education and skill for. So it's incredibly elitist, just like when they said at Amazon, those are scraps jobs. You're like, well, AOC, $150,000 a year might be a scrap to you, but I don't think it was to the people in your district, but you wouldn't know because you're never there and you don't have an office or a phone or any way for anyone to contact you. But
so I've been in those situations where people come and approach you and they don't agree with you. I thought Dianne Feinstein was great. I thought she handled the kids well. She had, I don't know if it was a teacher or the organizer of the kids.
It was an organizer, but I mean, what an example to set to those children, the rudeness.
But interrupting her, right.
Yes.
I mean, so I thought she handled it really well. But, I mean, from my perspective, I look at, I'm rural Wisconsin, so you raise the cost of manufacturing by raising the cost of energy. One, people can't afford, I mean, it's cold there. We just had a polar vortex. They can't afford to heat their houses, but you increase the cost of energy and you start to ship those jobs over to places like China where they have no standards. And if we live on the same planet and breathe the same air and drink the same water, isn't it better that we have the best policies here to manufacture in America instead of making sure that we have policies that close our factories and send them to China or India? This is flat out stupidity from the left, and I think we should call it for that. And by the way, we love cows.
Yeah, we
in
call it
Wisconsin.
loony left. That's why I like that phrase very much.
Cow flagellants, but that gives you cheese and butter and milk.
I'm not
and
sure
a
I want to
steak.
think about that right now.
Okay. So Tammy, the thing, that's why I want that tweet. It just, I really, you know, we're in charge. There's something really menacing.
Well, there was
about
another tweet where she said, "I'm the boss."
Yeah.
I mean, there's.
I missed that one.
It's like a 7-year-old at the dinner table, you know, deciding that they're going to make the choices. But the larger problem here, too, I think, is in how this Green New Deal has been responded to. You hear about how it's too expensive. But the fact is, the problem is exactly what Melissa was saying, is that it's not too expensive, of course. It will destroy lives. That's the answer. And that should have been, of course, Feinstein's answer in that, look, it is elitist. Everyone's going to have to pay more money. You're not going to have heating oil next year. You know, all of these things that make it a destructive force, that's what has. The moment you skip over what it really is to the cost, you kind of give up to this idea that it's feasible, that you should actually consider it. We should no more actually consider that Then if somebody said everybody would have enough money if every now and then everyone robbed a bank, well, you would not entertain that idea as let's see if we can count up how much money we'd have. No, you would say that's bad. We won't go there. But secondly, with Feinstein, she was also criticized for like being mean to the kids and talking down to them. She's the adult.
Exactly.
She's the adult.
They were so rude.
And she was nice considering.
Exactly right.
But this is a woman who is a mother, who knows how to talk to children sometimes. And that's I think Americans see this for what it is. But the argument against this hoax is not to skip past the hoax itself, which presumes it's relevant, but to start picking it apart as being.
Well, we're going to do that very regularly on our Loony Left segment,
Excellent.
which we love. Now, here we are. We've got the comb, we got the salad. What could possibly go wrong? Our 2020 update is after the break.
Better stay for this.
Kamala. But I definitely
Kamala, you got to get that.
Kamala. I think what's fantastic about this is President Trump has made all of these people feel like, oh my gosh, anyone can win this. Look who won last time. Anyone can do it. So for the Democrats, they're all jumping in, but it has to be really exciting because it's like walking into a supermarket and you have every kind of, I won't say fruit, but you have every kind of thing you could possibly choose
but it's
from.
all past the expiration date.
Oh,
so.
good.
Oh, very nice.
Yes. Everyone running now, though, they actually imagine their futures of being in Hillary Clinton's cabinet and in that administration. So it ruined their entire view for the next 20 years. This is why everyone's suddenly scrambling. But I think for Bernie, it's clearly he won't be the nominee. There are some Democrats now thinking he shouldn't be able to run as within there.
Right.
So that could be.
Well, he isn't a Democrat. Let's be honest.
And maybe he needs a fourth beach house.
He must be really frustrated, though, that he started all this stuff, and now other people are running away with it, and he's not going to be.
As you noted, he's changed, though. It's theater for him too. It's an adjustment, but maybe he wants to see more bread lines, which is what drives him.
Oh, right. Well, listen, we're talking of a nice link to the food portion of the show. So here we are. So I've been very excited about this moment. So why have I got a salad and a comb? The reason is that Amy Klobuchar, who announced last week, the main thing that seems to be coming out about her is what a terrible, mean boss she is and the way she treats her staff with contempt. This is the reenactment. This is what actually happened. She was with a staff member. The staff member was dispatched to go and get her a salad for her lunch. Running through an airport, he dropped the fork. They sat on the plane. She had no utensils. It was a short flight. The airline couldn't give her a fork, whatever. So she pulled out a comb and started doing this and eating. That's where we're going to reenact. This is what really happened. Started eating there we are. Eating the salad with the comb.
Please tell me that was new.
And then she goes to her aide, clean it.
Now that was
what have I gotten myself into here? I don't want this thing.
That's literally.
Right back at you.
What kind of person?
I know you didn't use that before either, so it's probably very clean, right?
Yes, it reminds me. There's a brilliant line it reminds me of, which is Gore. This is such a sort of jump, but Gore Vidal's brilliant line about the Falklands War, about Britain and Argentina fighting over the Falklands, was like two bald men fighting over a comb. So that's my comb quote.
Now, let me say, for her, I'm not a fan of hers, obviously, but I think that was a very MacGyver kind of moment for her. It was either don't eat, eat it with your hands, or find a way to make it work.
But you needed to throw the comb away afterwards.
But the terrible thing is, you like her. Okay, well, she's nice to you. Anyway, all right, there we are. That's all we have time for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks to Tammy, Melissa, and Congressman Duffy. Mark Levin is up next. Please join us again next Sunday when the next revolution will be televised.
You're a good man.
Thank you.
So are you. Well, thank you. Former Solicitor General, former federal judge, former independent counsel. And your appearance couldn't be more important right now. So let's jump in. We have independent counsel Robert Mueller. He's got his team. He's actually special counsel. You were independent counsel under a specific statute, and you had obligations under that statute that you had to follow. He has a different statute with fewer obligations. And I wanted to ask you a question. And I've thought about this a lot. As I watch the coverage of Robert Mueller, I find out he's the most noble man to ever walk the earth. And so is his staff. I find members of Congress trying to pass laws to protect him from what I don't know. And I remember when you were an independent counsel, we had the paparazzi media on your front step. I saw you come out with a cup of coffee every now and then. We knew when you came up in the morning, when you went to bed at night. kind of different coverage. You were criticized constantly by the media. He's defended by the media. What do you make of that?
Night and day, Apple's and that kind of invasion of privacy. But, you know, we lived in a nice suburban area of McLean, Virginia. And
I remember your house. It was very nice.
Yeah, it's simple. Some of my
it's all over TV.
So, our Brady Bunch house.
Yes.
We had a carport, not a garage, and so forth. So, but Madison Court, is that a great name? We lived on Madison Court, and the press was pretty much ubiquitous.
But why do you think the distinction, the difference in coverage?
There's got to be a treaty of peace that with the networks, platforms, and so forth, they said, we're going to leave him alone.
They like him. They didn't like you. Do you think it's because of who you were investigating and who he's investigating? I mean, isn't that a logical conclusion?
It's a very logical conclusion. Someone who's investigating the president is likely to be very unpopular with a whole bunch of people, maybe 50%, 45% of the American people. But the media as a whole, even there were some great heroes in the media as far as my own investigation was concerned. But the media as a whole, I think, is pretty sympathetic to those who are investigating a Republican, Watergate, Richard Nixon, and then maybe not so, those investigating a Democrat, and especially a very well-liked, controversial though he was, but Bill Clinton was likable, empathetic, charming, and he also was very effective at using surrogates to attack the investigation, whereas President Trump has chosen, I think unwisely, to do the attacks himself.
You and your investigation were attacked relentlessly. Were there any efforts by members of Congress to protect your investigation, to protect your appointment? Were there any sympathetic voices in most of the media? I know there were a few reporters who were actually reporters, but as a whole, it was pretty dastardly, wasn't it?
Yeah, I would say no with respect to members of Congress. There may have been some speeches on the floor from time to time. Then when the going really got rough during the Monica Lewinsky phase of the investigation and the press criticism became extremely intense, I do remember vividly a call from Senator Orrin Hatch saying, Ken, you need to get out there. And it wasn't that I was hiding for reasons we've already discussed. You need to get out there. You should do this and you should do that. My friend Ted Olson said, you need to go on Larry King Live. Remember those days? And he just gives you the microphone. You can say what you want to say. But I felt at that time, and I was wrong, I felt at that time that I needed to be much more discreet, careful. There were times when I would go before the media. There were times that we provided public information out of the investigation without running afoul. Here's the key. Don't reveal grand jury information because that's a crime.
I have no idea what Robert Mueller's voice sounds like. He doesn't speak to the public. I don't mean leaking. I'm talking about something else. We don't get many press releases from the special counsel's office. I have my own views of leaks and so forth. But isn't there an obligation, the U.S. Attorney's Office, your office, you at least communicated some information to the American people, given the power of the office and given the reach of the office and given the fact it involves an elected president of the United States and people surrounding him?
I err on the side of providing public information. I think it is an issue of accountability and responsibility. It's nowhere in the statute, right? It's just a judgment call. Are you going to try to educate the public as appropriate without besmirching people's reputations? I think that's one of the key things that we're going to be seeing in the Mueller investigation. One of the things prosecutors should not do is go hammer someone in the public domain. You either present an indictment to the grand jury or you don't.
You know who agrees with you?
Who?
The late Leon Jaworski.
Yeah.
Who was involved in the Watergate matter. Because that was really a new area. And when he came to writing a report, they were somewhat criticized. He said, look, I'm not going to write a report that starts trashing people or insinuating things that I couldn't bring to court or I couldn't prove. That would be a bigger abuse of power than some of these people that I'm investigating. You concur with that?
I completely concur. He wrote the so-called roadmap, but it didn't fill in a whole lot of details because, by definition, it's going to be a one-sided report, right? It's not going to reflect. On the other hand, there's another way of looking at this set of facts or this particular testimony. So I think it is a matter of fundamental fairness that prosecutors who do have this great power should not prosecute by press release or by innuendo and public comments.
Why is that?
It's because of our sense of fairness and justice, life and liberty. You know, we have in this country the baseline of liberty, and your liberty is to a certain extent being the liberty of your reputation. You know, reputation. And if you, the late Vince Foster said, who took his own life, and that was part of our investigation, and just 2 months before he took his own life, he said to the graduates of the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, and I think this makes the point, in our profession, he's a lawyer, in our profession, if you lose your reputation, you lose everything. Well, reputation is just an important period. That's why the law protects reputations from defamation, from libel and slander and the like. It's an important part of our decency as a human being that we don't go besmirching another human being, or if we do, then we might have to face a civil action.
Particularly, it would seem to me, in the criminal context. You're a prosecutor. You have enormous power, particularly a special counsel. I would say has more power than your typical U.S. attorney. And we have a Bill of Rights for a reason. Due process, presumption of innocence. You have a right to cross-examine witnesses. You have a right to see the charges that are going to be brought against you and so forth. In this case, with Robert Mueller, the report that they say is going to be released relatively soon, the president's lawyers haven't seen it. They haven't had an opportunity to respond to anything, to prepare a response to it. It's not vetted through your typical courtroom. And you don't have you don't have discovery, pre-discovery, where, you know, depositions and questions, none of that. You have a prosecutor writing a report, whatever that report says, without any checks and balances whatsoever. He's not a judge, and he's not a jury. And yet this statute tried to limit the power of a report, unlike your statute that you worked under and the independent counsel statute. Explain.
Well, the independent counsel statute, which has gone away, it existed for 21 years, was really putting a pretty heavy thumb on the scales toward impeachment. Remember, it was passed in the wake of Watergate, so the country had been through an impeachment process. The president resigned. So what do we want this special prosecutor, whatever we call him, independent counsel, special counsel, what do we want that person to do? Well, we want that person not just to make prosecutorial decisions. We want the person to write a report. And we want the person to send that report to the House of Representatives. It's one of the reasons, Mark, that Justice Antonin Scalia, in his magnificent dissent, the case that upheld the constitutionality of the independent counsel statute, said this statute is, he used these great terms, acrid with the smell of impeachment. That's been improved. Under the regulations under which Bob Mueller was appointed, there is a reporting requirement, but it is a confidential report under these regulations to go to the Attorney General. Then the Attorney General is to give a report, not to say, oh, here's the Bob Mueller report. So the Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr, is going to have to make a judgment. What am I, as Attorney General, going to report up to Congress?
So it's really a completely different reporting requirement.
Completely.
And yet people talk about this as the impeachment report. Is it because of things that Nancy Pelosi and Gerald Nadler have said, that we want to see this report before we make decisions about impeachment, which they know they don't even have a right to see this report?
I think there's a failure to understand, to drill into the regulations under which Mueller was appointed. Now, the regulations could be jettisoned, right? They said, okay, we're not going to use those regulations anymore. But those regulations have been in effect in both Republican and Democrat administrations. They came into being in the Clinton administration. So they sort of stood the test of time.
20 years, you said they've been there.
They have been around for a while. And so I don't know how many special counsels have been appointed. But the point is, those regulations have been there on the books for Congress to look at, and if Congress had come to the judgment that it liked the old system of a full report to the Congress of the United States, it should have stepped in long before now. I think there's an assumption that isn't grounded in the text of the regulations.
When we come back, I want to discuss with you these recent revelations by Andrew McCabe and others, what's been going on at the FBI. You worked at the Justice Department. I worked at the Justice Department. You were Solicitor General at the Justice Department. I was Chief of Staff at the Justice Department. This FBI situation is very, very troubling, and I want to pursue that with you in a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget, you can join us on Levin TV. That's Levin TV by going to blazetv.com/Mark to sign up. We'd love to have you. blazetv.com/Mark, or give us a call.
Judge.
All three. There was really no controversy, at least with respect to the first two. Do you ever recall the director of the FBI, the deputy director of the FBI, the general counsel of the FBI leaking? Were you aware of, when you were with the Justice Department, that they would have been leaking?
No, and it would have been really out of character for both Judge Bill Webster and Judge Louis Freeh. Those were straight shooters. They were honest as the day is long. They really embodied the goals and values of the FBI. The FBI, fidelity, bravery, integrity, and that integrity word is so terribly important because we've got to believe in the honesty of law enforcement. The FBI has an enormous amount of power, so the person at the top sets the tone, and they set a great tone, a high moral tone.
Well, we have the former deputy director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe. He's made a lot of news lately with a 60 Minutes interview, and he's on a celebrity tour, basically, hawking his book on nighttime shows, which is a remarkable thing to me, because on 60 Minutes, from my perspective, he confessed to a cabal over there at the Justice Department that was trying to trigger the 25th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Clearly, they never read it, because it's a complicated amendment. And there's no role whatsoever for the FBI. And he says in part that the reason that he was concerned about this is because the president fired Comey. Well, the president fired Comey, and among those recommending his firing was the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Mr. Rosenstein. He says, well, the president asked me, you're the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. You can do it or not do it. And then they talk about the Deputy Attorney General of the United States talking about he disagrees with this, wiring himself. Wiring himself to do what? To talk to the President of the United States about firing Comey, which he recommended? I must say, I see this as a cabal. I see this as an effort to overthrow a sitting president. I have never seen anything like this. I don't think anything like this has happened in modern American history. I'm curious to know what your take is on it.
I was deeply disappointed, and frankly, I was both saddened and angered to read about and to hear about now with the recent reports from the former acting director of the FBI. I mean, who do they think they are? They're part of the executive branch, and the idea of the FBI, with all of its authority, all of its power, and it has an enormous amount of power, turning that power in a direction against a duly elected president of the United States is appalling, unless there was some reasonable ground to believe that the president was engaged in criminal conduct or that the president had become an agent of a foreign government. There's, to me, zero evidence that President Trump, whether one loves him or does not love him, was in any way an agent of any foreign power. He had relationships, obviously, but who doesn't, who's coming into the presidency? But I just think it was an enormously poor judgment on the part of the leadership of the FBI. And it's really a kind of, who do you think you are? You're part of the executive branch, and this is really above your pay grade. At a minimum, that's the kind of decision. If there was something that seriously wrong in the view of the FBI, they go knock on the Attorney General's office, and the Attorney General goes and knocks on the counsel of the President's office. And you do this through regular order as opposed to essentially runaway cops.
But I'm trying to figure out what exactly did he do that would merit this kind of rogue hysteria. He fires the FBI director. It's the FBI director. He's allowed to fire the FBI director. He's allowed to fire pretty much whomever he wishes. It had no effect on the Russia investigation. The Russia investigation has expanded into all kinds of areas. The The president hasn't interfered with their funding. As a matter of fact, Mr. McCabe testified under oath before Congress that everything's going along swimmingly with the Russia investigation, that they've gotten all the funds that they need. There's no evidence of obstruction per se. The president has the inherent power to hire and fire pretty much as he wishes. This seemed to me to be a pretext. What do you think?
I don't know if it was a pretext or just an abysmal misunderstanding of our constitutional order and the power of the president. We do not have an imperial presidency. There are many checks and there are many balances, especially the United States Congress, especially the House of Representatives. If something has gone awry, the founding generation said we want that judgment as to whether to put the impeachment process in place in the People's House, not in the Senate, but in the People's House. The Senate will eventually have its role. That is the role of, in our constitutional structure, checking the president. Now, there is this 25th Amendment process in light of the assassination of John Kennedy and so forth, but that's at a level that involves the cabinet. It does not involve the Federal Bureau of Investigation, with folks, and no one involved in the decision were, appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. That's a huge check and a huge balance that we have in our system. The idea of a PAS, presidential appointment, but Senate approval. That's a check, that's a balance. So we had essentially an unaccountable branch, or the leadership, I should say, of an unaccountable part of the branch of the executive that I think was just taking very strange steps. And you're right. I think, Mark, I think it was unprecedented. And it sounds in the nature of a movement toward a coup d'etat.
Which is shocking. Ken Starr, when we come back, you've had a lot of experience with the Clintons.
Custody now back to life, liberty, and Levin.
Ken Starr, you're like an expert on the Clintons. I don't know if that's a compliment or not, but you've written this outstanding book, Contempt, a memoir of the Clinton investigation. So I want to ask you about the Clintons. We're said that the comments the president makes about this investigation, about the FBI, are unprecedented. Are they unprecedented?
No. I wish the president, in the exercise of his discretion, would leave the nasty job of attacking the prosecutor to others, but he does it himself. He is his own follower of his own instincts.
He's transparent.
That he is. Bill and Hillary were more clever, if I may say so. I think it's more clever because they were...
or more devious.
Definitely more devious, because they would attack the investigation and the investigators, the prosecutor and the prosecutors, indirectly through surrogates, especially James Carville, Sidney Blumenthal, and other members of the Clinton cast.
So Louis Freeh, the FBI director doing much of this, he would be attacked. Was he persona non grata at the White House?
As far as I understand it, yes. That Judge Freeh, Louis Freeh, was an absolute straight shooter, just rock-ribbed integrity, and that didn't play well in the Clinton White House.
I recall even Janet Reno was frowned upon, and they started taking shots at her through the media, too, through surrogates. Is that correct?
Yeah, throughout the first term, Mark, the first Clinton term, she was appointing a number of independent counsel. I had lots of company. And just by way of example, Henry Cisneros. And there really was some culpability there, a guilty plea by Linda Medlar and so forth, so these names from the past. But the point is, she was calling them as she saw them. I think she was being honest and straightforward. But things then changed when the calls came after the '96 election for the appointment of an independent counsel to look into campaign finance and for perhaps a possibility of foreign campaign.
Johnny Chung, I remember all these.
All these
the
things.
Riotti group, yeah.
Yeah. And she said, and Louis Freeh, as I recall, Mark, recommended the appointment of an independent counsel. She brought in a special counsel to assess the evidence and to make a recommendation. And he recommended the appointment of an independent counsel. She refused to do that. Now, throughout the investigation until the Monica Lewinsky phase, she was cooperative. She didn't get in the way. In fact, she gave us, as you may recall, additional assignments to look into the travel office firings. That was an add-on.
She kept plopping them on top of you.
Yeah.
And I also remember discussion about removing her and replacing her with a new Attorney General. That kind of discussion took place, too. So it's important that the American people understand context, understand precedent. We're told these things going on today have never happened before. The things going on today that have never happened before, as far as I'm concerned, involves a lot of what's taken place at the FBI. John Solomon of The Hill just reported, just a few days ago, that testimony provided to Congress behind closed doors by the general counsel of the FBI, who's now under James Baker under investigation himself. He said right up to the last moment he believed Hillary Clinton should be charged with felony violations of the Espionage Act, and that it wasn't until the last moment he was convinced that they didn't have enough proof to demonstrate she had intent, specific intent. Now, that's an interesting point because the statute doesn't talk about specific intent. This espionage statute has been around over 100 years. It talks about gross negligence, which does not require specific intent. What do you make of this? I mean, it's really confounding in many ways. First, Comey clears Hillary Clinton in a bizarre press conference. He doesn't even talk to the Attorney General. One of the things the Inspector General complained about was that he undermined her authority. That's the Attorney General's decision, whether somebody's charged or prosecuted, not the director of the FBI. Then a few days before the election, oh, we have more emails, and then quickly over the weekend they say, but don't worry, everything's fine. And then we have this general counsel now saying, or he said, I thought she should have been charged all along, but I was convinced at the end. What do you make of what took place at the FBI?
The FBI should have been in full consultation with the Justice Department. He used the term, Mark, undermining the authority of the Attorney General by the way Jim Comey conducted himself. I would say he usurped authority. And that's what the Rod Rosenstein memo said in May leading up to the firing of James Comey by the President of the United States. I wish the President had taken this action much earlier. I think we would have avoided an enormous amount of grief had he, because Jim Comey, and you and I are both alums of the Justice Department, and we know the hierarchy, and he knew the hierarchy. He had served in the Justice Department. So this was not inadvertent. He took the authority of the Attorney General and assumed that for himself. And then there may have been a very weak legal analysis going into the usurpation of authority. That is a misreading of the statute, because Mr. Baker, the former general counsel, was, after all, the general counsel. He's the lawyer to the FBI, and so you would think that his view would carry a special weight in terms of the meaning of the statute, and he thought, according to the testimony that we're now seeing, that she had in fact committed crimes. One of the reasons that I chose to write this book about the Clinton investigation is we felt that Hillary Clinton was guilty of crimes in the Arkansas phase of the investigation. We couldn't prove it. Prosecutors will frequently say there's a difference between what I know and what I can prove. And because of missing witnesses, Susan McDougal, for example, would not agree to testify. She went into contempt of court. The name of the book, Contempt. The president was held in contempt. So, but the point is, the independent counsel statute contemplates working with the FBI, but it wasn't the FBI that was making these decisions as to whether to prosecute Jim Guy Tucker or anyone else. It was the responsibility of the Justice Department or the independent counsel.
So in this FBI, you had at least some of them pushing for the 25th Amendment. You had them making decisions they had no power to make. Ken Starr, I want to ask you about congressional oversight. The Democrats have multiple committees starting multiple investigations on anything you can think of related to Trump and Trump world. Now, you know, I look at the Constitution, I look at the history of hearings, the history of what Congress does, and maybe what it shouldn't do. It has legitimate oversight function. There's no question about that. Its job is to legislate, so it kind of needs to know what's going on. But that's not what's going on. If you want 10 years of the president's past tax returns, or you want access to the Deutsche Bank information from the past, and they say we need to look at these things also because of potential impeachment. It talks about high crimes and misdemeanors, among other things, while he's president of the United States. The American people elected this man, despite the fact he wouldn't release his tax returns. And by the way, members of Congress aren't required to release their tax returns either, including Nancy Pelosi. If I'm the president of the United States and I've got good lawyers, I'm going to say, you know what? I'm not giving you that information. You have no legitimate legislative basis for it whatsoever, other than to try and harass me, to try and ruin my businesses and my family. So I'll see you in court. Ultimately, I'll see you in the Supreme Court. What's your take on this?
I think you're onto something. The legislative oversight power is in furtherance of the responsibilities given to Congress under Article 1. Conducting a tax investigation is nowhere near the powers of Congress under Article 1, Section 8. And it's almost sounding in the nature of a bill of attainder. It's violating the idea of we don't pass laws or investigate individuals qua individuals unless it's relating, again, to our legislative function. What is it that we're elected to do? We're here to oversee the executive branch and to pass laws and so forth. So I think there is a serious question under separation of powers, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because too many times as we march on in our 203rd century as a constitutional republic, we don't return to these fundamental constitutional principles of, wait a second, what's your job, Congress? Mr. President, are you exceeding your powers? Courts, are you exceeding your powers? These are questions that we should continually ask, and I think it's a very important question in terms of seeking the president's tax returns.
And you and I discuss these things. Very few other people do. The debate over the report is, when will it be released? What will it contain? Not a debate over the fact of a report. The debate over congressional investigations isn't a debate over, well, what are they allowed to investigate under our Constitution? What are the limits? As opposed to, well, they get 10 years of tax returns, or what will be in the tax returns?
It needs to relate to the legislative authority, legislative power.
Exactly. And yet our media really do the drumbeat for this sort of thing. They're not particularly informed or literate in these areas, and they don't particularly care to be. Your dealings with the media were very difficult, and yet from time to time you found reporters